Hello everybody. In this lesson, we will study the relationship between zeros and the coefficients of a polynomial. We already know what a zero of a polynomial is. The zero of a polynomial is that value of the variable which will make the whole polynomial equal to zero. And we also studied the general form of a linear equation. For example, we have P of x is equal to ax plus b. This is the general form of a linear equation. And we learned that the zero of a linear polynomial is minus b by a. Now in this lesson, we will look at the zeros of a quadratic polynomial. Let's take the quadratic polynomial P of x equal to 2x squared minus 8x plus 6. Let's find out what are the zeros of this polynomial. In order for us to find out what are the zeros of this polynomial, we will equate this polynomial to 0. 2x squared minus 8x plus 6 equal to 0. Now we will factorize this polynomial. We have learned how to factorize a polynomial. Let's recollect our method. We will write down the sum of the polynomial and the product of the polynomial over here. The sum is the middle term minus 8x, and the product is the multiplication of 2x squared times 6, which is going to be 12x squared. Now think of two numbers. If you multiply, you get 12x squared, and if you add them, you get negative 8x. So the two numbers are 6 times 2 will give you 12, and negative 6 plus 2 will give you negative 8. So we can split the middle term, negative 8x, as negative 6x plus minus 2. So both needs to be negative. So we have 2x squared. Negative 8x can be split as negative 6x, negative 2x plus 6. And the whole equation is 0. Now if we take the common factors of this, the common factor of 2 and 6 is 2, and the common factors of x squared and x is x. So what's left in the brackets is going to be x minus 3. Because look, if you open the brackets, we will still get the same thing. 2x times x is going to be 2x squared. 2x times negative 3 is negative 6x. Let's come over here. And what do we remove the common factor? Negative 2. So what are we left with? X minus 3. And the whole thing is going to be equal to 0. Now what is the common factor in these two? It's x minus 3. So we can remove x minus 3 as a common factor. So we will be left with 2x minus 2 times x minus 3. Now if you observe over here, 2x and 2. 2 is a common factor, so we can remove that out. So 2 is out, so we are left with x minus 1 times x minus 3 equal to 0. So the factors of this polynomial are x minus 1, x minus 3. In order for this polynomial to be 0, either x minus 1 should be equal to 0 or x minus 3 should be equal to 0. So we can equate each factor, x minus 1 equal to 0 or x minus 3 is equal to 0. Therefore x is going to be equal to 1 or x is going to be equal to 3. So the zeros of this polynomial are 1 and 3. Because when we replace x with 1, the whole polynomial is going to be equal to 0, or when we replace x with 3, the whole polynomial is going to be equal to 0. So observe, when the 0 of the polynomial is 1, what is its factor? X minus 1. When the 0 of the polynomial is 3, what is its factor? X minus 3. So in general, when the 0 of a polynomial is equal to a, what will be the factor of that polynomial? X minus a. Now let's figure out what will be the sum of the zeros and what will be the product of the zeros of this polynomial. Let's see what is the sum of the zeros of this polynomial. We have two zeros of the polynomial, 1 and 3. So 1 plus 3 is 4. Now if you observe, 4 is nothing but negative 8 over 2. Now what is negative 8? It is the coefficient of x. And what is 2? It is the coefficient of x squared. So the sum of the zeros of a quadratic polynomial is nothing but negative the coefficient of x divided by the coefficient of x squared. So very easy to remember, the sum of the zeros of a quadratic polynomial will be negative coefficient of x divided by the coefficient of x squared. Now let's see what are the product of the zeros of a quadratic polynomial. So the product of the zeros of this polynomial will be 1 times 3, which is going to be equal to 3. But if you observe, can I get this 3 by 6 divided by 2? Yes. And observe over here, 6 happens to be the constant term and 2 is the coefficient of x squared. So we can get the product of the zeros of a quadratic polynomial as constant term divided by the coefficient of x squared in general. So this is how we can figure out the product of the zeros of a quadratic polynomial. So the sum of the zeros is minus b by a and the product of the zeros is c over a. Let's try this. The question is, find the zeros of the quadratic polynomial x squared plus 7x plus 10 and verify the relationship between the zeros and the coefficients. So let's find out first the zeros of this polynomial. In order to do that, we need to factor them. So we know the factorization method by splitting the middle term. Let's write down the sum over here and product over here. The sum is 7x and the product is 1 times 10, which is 10x squared. Now think of two numbers. If you multiply, you get 10. If you add, you get 7. So obviously it's 5 and 2. So 5 plus 2 will give us 7 and 5 times 2 is going to give us 10. Now we can split the middle term 7x as 2x and 5x. So let's see this. X squared plus 7x can be written as 2x plus 5x plus 10. Now taking the common factors over here, x is the common factor, so we are left with x plus 2. And taking the common factors over here, 5 is the common factor. We are left with x plus 2 equal to 0. So now the common factors in these two are x plus 2 and x plus 5. So the zeros of this polynomial are x equal to negative 2 and x equal to negative 5, because these are the values that are going to make the polynomial equal to 0. Now let's find out what are the sum of these zeros and what is the product of these zeros and how they are related to the coefficients. Let us see the sum of the zeros, negative 2 plus negative 5, and that's going to be equal to negative 7. Observe over here, negative 7 happens to be the coefficient of x over, I can write it as 1, and 1 happens to be the coefficient of x squared. So we have verified that the sum of the zeros is same as negative coefficient of x divided by coefficient of x squared. Now let's figure out the product and see how is it related to the coefficients. The product of the zeros are negative 2 times negative 5, which is going to be 10. And if you observe, I can write this as 10 over 1. And 10 happens to be the constant term, and 1 is nothing but the coefficient of x squared. So we have verified that the product of the zeros of a quadratic polynomial is the constant term divided by the coefficient of x squared. So there is a relationship between the zeros and the coefficients of a quadratic polynomial. Let's try this. Find a quadratic polynomial, the sum and product of whose zeros are negative 3 and 2 respectively. So we know that the sum of the polynomial, if we take alpha and beta as the zeros of the polynomial, alpha plus beta over here is negative 3. And the product of the polynomial, alpha beta, is 2. Now remember, if we know the sum of the zeros and the product of the zeros, the polynomial general form is going to be x squared minus alpha plus beta, the sum of the zeros times x plus the product of the zeros. Now we can easily plug it into this general form, x squared minus, what is the sum of the zeros in this example? It's negative 3. Plus, what is the product of the zeros given in this example? It's 2. So we have a polynomial x squared, negative times negative 3 plus 3x plus 2. So in general, this will be a quadratic polynomial whose sum of the zeros is negative 3 and the product of the zeros is 2. So we went in the reverse order. When the sum of the zeros and the product of the zeros is given, we can find out what will be the corresponding polynomial. Let's try this. Find a quadratic polynomial, each with the given numbers as the sum and product of its zeros respectively. So we know that the sum of the zeros of this polynomial is 1 over 4 and the product of the zeros is negative 1. And we know the general form of a polynomial when we know the sum and the product of the zeros. It is going to be x squared minus alpha plus beta x plus alpha beta. So we can easily plug it in. X squared minus the sum of the zeros is 1 over 4x plus the product of the zeros is negative 1. So if we write it down without brackets, it's going to be x squared minus 1 over 4x minus 1. But since we have a coefficient as a fraction, let's try to get rid of the fraction. If we remove 1 over 4 as a factor outside, what will remain in the bracket? It's going to be 4x squared, because look, if I open the brackets, I'm going to get back the x squared, minus x minus 4. Because if I open the brackets, I'm still going to get back this polynomial. So in general, 4x squared minus x minus 4 will have the same zeros and will have the sum of and the product of the zeros as 1 over 4 and negative 1 respectively. Let's try this. The sum of the zeros and the product of the zeros is given. We are supposed to find the corresponding polynomial. So we know that the sum of the zeros is root 2 and the product of the zeros is 1 over 3. And we also know that in general, when we know the sums and zeros of the polynomial, it's going to be x squared minus alpha plus beta, the sum of the zeros, times x plus alpha beta. So now we can substitute x squared minus the sum of the zeros is root 2 times x, and the product of the zeros is 1 over 3. Now since we have a fraction, we can remove 1 over 3 as a common factor. So what do we get? If I remove 1 over 3 as the common factor, x squared can be written as 3x squared, because if I multiply these two, I will get back x squared, minus root 2x can be written as 3 root 2x, because if I multiply 1 over 3 with 3 root 2, I will get back negative root 2x. And 1 over 3 removing 1 over 3 as the common factor, we are left with 1. So p of x, the polynomial, is 3x squared minus 3 root 2x plus 1 for the given sum of zeros and the product of zeros. So we know this is the method that is used to find out a polynomial when we know the sum and the product of the zeros of a polynomial. I hope you have understood the lesson. My name is Asghar Ali Khan. My mission is helping you learn. So please share and subscribe this channel. Thank you.